dinâmica de meia hora para cada convidado, né? A critério de cada convidado tem uma dinâmica aí própria. E ao final, a gente tem meia hora também de tempo para uma interação com a audiência, uma interação também entre os próprios convidados, tá? Então não se esqueçam aí, por gentileza, de fazer suas perguntas aí, tá? A gente sorteou aqui a ordem no começo, então a gente começa pelo bem.
Do I just start talking? Okay. Okay, thank you, translator in my ears, for telling me I can move the headset. I guess the first thing to do would be show the trailer, the video that's up there. On our sound people, oh, they put that on. Just says Semblance, Nintendo Switch, something? No? Yeah? Maybe? Okay. I'll just describe the game frame by frame. So, the top left pixel is magenta, and there's sort of a nice hue going from left to right. And okay, there we go. So as you can see, Frostpunk is the second highest production value of the best games. We didn't want to do that to them. Dead Cells is maybe like 6th or 7th. Anyway. So yeah, the way we've been describing that game, because we're making a platformer in 2018, is we have to go very hard. So we've been saying it's the first true platformer, because everything else in the genre up until now has been a lie, unfortunately. They have technically just been running and jumping on platformers. But Semblance is the first game where you can actually morph, shift, and change the platforms themselves, because the world is made of Play-Doh. We used to say the world was made of Play-Doh, but our publisher told us they had a few emails, so we don't want to get sued. So it's a world made of Play-Doh. So it's the first game where platforming is technically, linguistically, the verb, so therefore it's the first true platformer. And it's obviously a ridiculous thing to say, but we're making a platformer in 2018, so you have to go really hard and like shock people into understanding what the game's about. And that quote has been on like IGN and GameSpot, so we're totally screwed. But hey. And I'm just going to keep talking until Sergio butts in, so I hope he's not really a moderator, he's just going to tell me when to stop. So we started making that game. It was our final year university project where we were studying at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. And we had an external examiner who was this extra play developer who worked at Naughty Dog. And he's like one of the first few names you see when the Uncharted games and The Last of Us credits scroll. So he was like very, impressive guy. And he saw this game and it was just about the character changing shape, and he said, you should make this into a commercial game. So we stopped working on it as our final year project and started working on it part-time. And he funded it a little bit, and then we found an investor, and then we started traveling a lot to try and tell people about it. We got a lot of scholarships and festivals flying us places, and through that we eventually got signed by a publisher, Good Shepherd Entertainment. They also published Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, which probably is the most well-known of their things. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. to making this platformer, and this is kind of a peak to be on stage with these people who will make very amazing games. It's quite crazy to be here with this tiny platformer that we started as a university project, and it's gone very far. Yeah. The challenges.
Your platform looks fucking amazing.
Thank you. I paid him some South African rands for that, and they aren't very valuable, so he went above and beyond. Thank you. So yeah, the challenges making this game were numerous. Technically, it's actually quite challenging. The terrain deformation has not been done before for clearly a very apparent reason. Is because it's very hard to do, like storing all that data. Our game is like 2.5 gigabytes when you download it, and that's because all the mesh data of the levels is stored in the levels, and we kept trying to optimize it, but we couldn't figure it out. So the game actually came from a glitch, because the game used to just be about the character changing shape, which wasn't that interesting, and Mushroom 11 had already done that way more interestingly. But we were trying to make the game set in a soft world where the character was soft, so we wanted the world around it to feel soft as well. So we had this bug where every time you dashed into a platform, it would kind of sink down a bit lower because we wanted it to feel soft. But there was this bug where it kept going lower and lower every time you did that, and then our eyes kind of widened. The programmer tweeted a GIF, and people were like, "Wow, that's an amazing feature." And he was like, "Yeah, I'm pretty good. What can I say?" Sugar, his name's Sugar as well, so he's just a consistently ridiculous person. He went off into the woods, cried, committed a few felonies and blood sacrifices that we don't like to talk about. He basically went on to 4chan. And when he came back, he had this mechanic working, and it was super interesting. And it was so interesting that we had no idea how it worked and what the potential for it was. And so while making this game, we were kind of discovering the possibility space as we went. We kept accidentally running into mechanics we hadn't thought about. We have this sort of wall jump mechanic in the game, which isn't actually a wall jump so much as just making these dents in the wall, and so you make this sort of ladder that you climb up. So a lot of these things emerged out of this really simple but interesting mechanic that slowly you just discovered. And through playtesting a lot, players kept finding interesting things about it that we kept running with. Additional challenges, which I'm sure you as South American devs understand, is it's really hard to make games in the global south if you're trying to sell to the west and you don't have the journalists here, you don't have the platform contacts, you don't have all these things. You've got to spend a lot of money traveling to the events. I was back in Johannesburg for 4 days, and I'd just come back from a 24-hour flight from Los Angeles, which is how long it takes to get there for E3. So this 10-hour flight to Sao Paulo was super chilled. That was easy. So a lot of crazy challenges making games in South Africa. There's not a lot of government funding, not a lot of arts funding. You have no contacts with everyone. The dev scene there is very small. Luckily, we have had a few really big successes in South Africa, like Broforce, the most American game ever made, is made in South Africa. Now you know. So having people who've done that and have really good international contacts has been super useful, but it was very hard to overcome those challenges. So we've done 20 plus cities on 5 continents in the last 18 months, and I think we did 4 continents in the last 4 weeks alone. It's just you have to travel that much to compensate for the lack of things you have in your scene. Yeah, he's laughing at me, I don't know. Apart from that, it's been really easy. Next question.
Can you tell a little bit more about the playtest? You told that it was very important.
Yeah, so playtesting was extremely important making this game because, like I said, it was a mechanic. We joke about it being the first real platformer when we pitch it, but even objectively, it's this mechanic where you're not, because it's kind of doing something different with the genre, you're not really sure, you don't have reference to draw from. So you're kind of discovering what it means if you can actually move the platforms. And at a basic level, you do playtesting just to see how players basically mess up your beautifully designed 5-step puzzle, and then they just like use this like wall jump mechanic to jump over the platform and then land on the collectible. So you literally don't understand how this mechanic works, and you made it. So you have to playtest the mechanic just to figure out, make your puzzles not have like really easy solutions, but at the same time you're just playtesting and basically letting players figure out how your mechanics work, and you kind of riff off them, bring them into your game, and do all this sort of stuff. So playtesting was super important, both for discovering how this mechanic worked and where it could go, as well as just, you know, standard QA.
When you were designing the game, did you have a player profile in your head, or you discovered that?
I found this question really hard because in business they say you shouldn't talk about target audience until you're targeting 35-year-old Fletchers in North Birmingham, basically. But I've never been able to go that specific. So we, in terms of who we're targeting with this game, originally we were just targeting people who had a deep understanding of the genre of platformers, because it's a game that's kind of postmodern and riffs on a lot of mechanics and puzzles literally taken from other games. So we were targeting players who had a lot of experience with platforming as a genre. But slowly, when we tested at shows, we saw that, you know, the art style really drew in, you know, kids and people from lots of different backgrounds. So we really worked on lowering the skill floor of the game, like making it really easy and accessible to pick up. And as soon as we did that, we noticed kids would play the game and they wouldn't necessarily complete puzzles, but because the deforming and the interactions with the environment is so juicy or tactile, like they would do it just for the sake of that. It was literally like Play-Doh. It was literally digital Play-Doh. They were interacting with it just for the sake of it. Yeah, so our player profile was very specific in terms of hardcore platform players, but we ended up making this thing which visually is very accessible and inviting to non-hardcore gamers. And so we've tried to also make the gameplay a bit more accessible. So we've also made it so that we're not huge fans of puzzle games where if you get stuck, like linear puzzle games where if you get stuck, that's kind of the end of the game. You either figure out how the puzzle works or you never play it again, which I think can happen quite often. So all the puzzles in the game are accessible from the beginning of the game. And again, this is an accessibility thing. We know a lot of players don't finish games, so we want players to be able to see as much of the game as they'd like to before quitting eventually. And if you want to finish the game, you basically have to collect everything and complete all the puzzles, and then you get the full state. But if you don't want to do that, you don't have to as well. So just like the mechanic kind of evolved, so did the player audience, which might be a bad thing, but we'll see when it launches.
You told that the project, the origin of the project became from a student project, like a college or university. So can you tell us a little bit more about your previously experience and also about what did you have learned about doing this, your game?
Good question. That's why you're the moderator. So yeah, this is our first game, debut game. We've made a couple festival games that got shown in festivals around the world. The co-founder of the game, of the studio, Sugar, the programmer, he had a game which won the Amaze Johannesburg award, and it was shown at Amaze Berlin. And from about 2013, I was helping organize pretty much the only independent games event in South Africa and Africa called Amaze, which is the smaller version of Amaze Berlin. And that was kind of a weird sideways thing into being exposed to the indie game scene, because we had 5 to 10 international speakers a year and 5 to 10 African speakers, and then the rest of the South African scene. So from doing program management and curation and helping run that, I basically, by the last 2 years of university, knew every single person in the South African game dev scene. It also helps that there's only 500 of them, which is about half the Sao Paulo dev scene, from what I hear. But it was still really useful to basically know everyone in the South African game dev scene before you'd even left university. And then also I made really good friends with some pretty high profile independent game developers like JW and Rami at Flambeer. Yeah, a whole bunch of people, because they were just coming to Amaze every year. And so again, knowing those people before you graduate helps you a lot in terms of asking for advice and stuff like that, which is also a great thing that Big does, so good job, organizers. So a lot of I was doing a ton of community work and not necessarily making a ton of games. And there was a weird tension where I was kind of making games, but also not making games, and then I just luckily fell into this game that had some promise. And because of all this huge network and learning about PR and marketing from doing the festival, all these sort of things, it fed really strongly into running an independent game studio. And we were pretty much aiming to self-publish this game for the first maybe 1.5 years until end of last year. And so while we were doing that, it was all the things we learned were super useful. And while we were trying to self-publish the game, we learned a ton about PR and marketing, and now we just also have an extensive relationship base with a lot of journalists, which is super useful as well. Yeah, I think you also just, Amaze is a very artistic games festival. It very much focuses on games as art. And when you're actually trying to make a game commercially, the assumptions you have about that as well kind of get eroded a little bit. You find this balance between trying to be true to the artistic vision as well as making something that has commercial promise. So I think that was also something I learned making this game. And for us, it was also not necessarily about making the game, but about making a studio. So we made decisions based on what might be best for the studio in the long run, not necessarily for the game. Because we don't just want to make one game and then be done with it. We want to make several games. And I think that mindset is something maybe not necessarily a lot of independent developers have. So I think that was a really important mindset to have as well. That's why we're just kind of shipping the game. The game has so much depth to it that we could have done a 5-10 year job on this and made it a masterpiece. Probably, I don't know. I say that arrogantly, but we just decided it's our first game and we just want to ship it and take everything we've learned as a studio and as creators and move on to the next thing. There you go.
Do you consider that you have had any kind of mistake or an error or something that if you could make it again, you would make it different? Your project.
Yeah, no. I'm trying. So many. You sure we only have 30 minutes for this question? There's none that really stick out to me because I think at least with me, you often internalize them and just be like, that's kind of the decision you made, so it's hard to stick out. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think probably the biggest mistake we made was when we were still trying to self-publish. Every time we spoke to a journalist, we told them what period the game was coming out. So in early 2016, we told them it was coming out in Q3 of 2016, and then in mid-2016, we said Q4 of 2016. So I think the whole of 2017, we have like all these articles saying the game is coming out at different points. So that was probably a pretty big lesson to learn, is never tell people when your game is coming out until you're absolutely sure.
But that can be also a marketing strategy.
It could have. I'm not sure that worked. I'm also pretty sure there wasn't that much downside to it as well, but it just kind of looks silly, basically. That's the only real thing I can think about. There's definitely ones I could think about with more time, but off the top of my head, nothing that I can think about,
I think perhaps if one of you guys should ask something to Ben, if you have any particular question.
Nothing.
To Ben?
No pressure.
No pressure.
What do you think?
So, would you describe yourself as a genius? No.
No.
What do you think games that come out of South Africa are different in nature or kind from games in other areas?
It's a very good question, and I could talk about this for a long time. So there's two main factors. So I did talk at Maze Berlin about how diverse the game design movements across Africa are, and the games that are coming out of there are. But I'll still homogenize them for a second. I think Black Africans are very focused on the pure representational value of games right now. So they're all about making games literally just to see for the first time in their entire lives someone that looks like them on the screen and you can control them. And that's literally the most important thing. So they focus on very thematic representational works that perhaps aren't mechanically as good as stuff from the West. But while I was curating for Maze Johannesburg, it became very apparent to me that if you assess African games by Western standards, you're just going to falter all the time, because the things the West values as good aren't necessarily what's important to people in Africa. And I noticed that people were focusing on, works that were representational. So there's this African fantasy RPG called Orion, which has been like the Wall Street Journal and stuff, and it's just basically a fantasy RPG that uses African mythology, and it's a bit buggy and the mechanics aren't great, but it's a seminal work in terms of the representation of Black African mythology. People have been doing African superheroes in video games way before Black Panther became a movie. So there's that aspect. One of the interesting aspects about South Africa specifically is white South African creators in South Africa. There's this great phrase in Afrikaans, one of the native languages of South Africa, called soutpeel. And what a soutpeel is what Afrikaans people used to tell English people they were. And it basically means you have one foot in England, one foot in South Africa, and your genitals are hanging in the ocean, and they get very salty. So it's basically salt genital. And it's quite vile, but it's also a very interesting metaphor for what it's like to be a white South African, because you're both generationally European, but now African. And you have this weird liminality where you're both one thing and not a thing at the same time. So the trend I've seen coming out of South African creators who happen to be white is this weird satirical Western consumption. You have games like Broforce, Viscera Cleanup Detail, which is a cleaning up game basically, and Desktop Dungeons, which are all games that read as Western and have clearly a lot of knowledge about Western media and symbology, but then in representing that, satirize and parody it and sort of reject it at the same time. So you have this really interesting dynamic there, and then they sell it back to the West and make lots of money. So that's how I'd say they're different.
We can move on?
No, I'm good. I'm good.